In the teachings of the Buddha, suffering is not something to fear or hide from. It is a universal truth that touches every life, a silent teacher that shapes the depth of our understanding. Accepting suffering does not mean surrendering to pain or allowing it to dominate our existence. Instead, it means recognizing its presence with clarity and courage, understanding that it is part of the human journey and not a personal failure. When we accept suffering, we stop wasting energy resisting reality, and in that moment of honest acknowledgement, a doorway to wisdom quietly opens. The Buddha taught that pain becomes meaningful when we learn from it, observe it, and trace it back to its roots: desire, attachment, expectation, and illusion. By seeing these causes clearly, we begin to reclaim our inner freedom. True wisdom is not born from comfort. It emerges when we sit with our struggles, when we listen to the lessons hidden within our disappointments, and when we stop blaming the world for what is simply a natural part of existence. Acceptance transforms suffering from a burden into a guide. It teaches humility, patience, and compassion, not only toward ourselves, but toward every person who carries their own unseen battles. As we embrace suffering, we begin to understand the impermanent nature of all experiences, realizing that every difficulty, like every joy, will pass. This understanding softens our hearts and sharpens our insight, allowing us to walk through life with greater peace and less fear. The Buddha reminded us that suffering is not an endpoint, but a beginning, a starting point for self-discovery, mindfulness, and liberation. When we stop running from our pain and instead examine it with awareness, it reveals the illusions we cling to and the truths we ignore. Slowly, suffering becomes a mirror, reflecting the patterns that lead us into confusion and the habits that keep us bound. Through acceptance, we develop the strength to let go of what no longer serves us and the wisdom to choose actions rooted in clarity rather than impulse. This is why the first noble truth is not a message of despair, but an invitation to awaken. In embracing suffering, we gain the ability to rise above it, to transform it, and to discover a deeper, more grounded form of happiness, one not based on circumstances, but on understanding. Accepting suffering is the first step on the path to wisdom, because only by facing the truth of life can we learn to live freely, compassionately, and consciously. As we continue to walk on this path of understanding, the acceptance of suffering becomes not just a philosophical idea, but a daily practice, a way of seeing life with awakened eyes. When challenges arise, whether through loss, failure, heartbreak, or uncertainty, we learn to pause and observe instead of instantly reacting. This pause is powerful. It separates us from our impulses and gives us the space to respond with wisdom rather than emotion. The Buddha emphasized that mindfulness is the key to transforming suffering, for when we watch our thoughts and emotions with gentle awareness, they lose their power to control us. Slowly, we begin to recognize that suffering often intensifies when we cling to how things should be, rather than accepting how they truly are. Wisdom grows when we release these mental narratives and return to the present moment, where life is happening without distortion. As this clarity deepens, we discover that suffering, instead of weakening us, actually expands our inner capacity, our patience, resilience, and compassion. Each hardship we face becomes an opportunity to train the mind, to grow more stable in the face of uncertainty, and to remain calm even when life changes unexpectedly. In this way, suffering becomes a spiritual discipline, shaping our heart into one that understands the fragility of existence and the beauty that emerges from impermanence. With time, we stop asking, "Why is this happening to me?" and instead ask, "What is this trying to teach me?" This shift changes everything. It dissolves self-pity, breaks down resistance, and opens the mind to learning. We also begin to see suffering in others with new sensitivity, realizing that every person carries a world of pain that we may never fully know. This understanding awakens compassion, the kind of compassion the Buddha described as boundless, rooted in the recognition that we are all walking the same path of struggle and growth. With compassion comes connection, and with connection comes the wisdom that no one is alone in their journey. Accepting suffering does not mean we stop seeking happiness. It means we seek a deeper, more stable happiness, one that doesn't collapse when life becomes difficult. The Buddha taught that true peace arises not from escaping suffering, but from understanding it completely. When we no longer fear it, suffering loses its ability to imprison us. Instead, it becomes a messenger, guiding us toward a life free from unnecessary attachments and illusions. In this liberation, we find that wisdom is not something distant or mystical. It is simply the clarity that comes from seeing life as it truly is. And when we walk through life with such clarity, even in the midst of struggle, we carry a quiet light within us, a light that guides us, strengthens us, and illuminates the path for others who are still learning to accept their own suffering.
As we move further along this journey, we begin to understand that accepting suffering is not a one-time realization, but a continuous unfolding of awareness. A lifelong practice that deepens each time life presents us with new challenges. The Buddha taught that wisdom grows layer by layer, just as a lotus rises slowly from the mud, and our willingness to face discomfort without turning away strengthens this growth. Every moment of suffering becomes a doorway that invites us to look within, to recognize the patterns of craving, fear, and resistance that shape our experiences. When we consciously step through this doorway with patience and openness, we cultivate the ability to see life without distortion. This clarity teaches us that suffering is often intensified not by the situation itself, but by the stories we create around it, the expectations we hold, the comparisons we make, and the attachments we refuse to release. As our understanding evolves, we learn to gently loosen our grip on these illusions, allowing life to flow more naturally. This does not make difficulties disappear. Instead, it transforms how we carry them. We become less reactive, more grounded, and more attuned to the present moment. Over time, suffering becomes less of an enemy and more of a teacher whose purpose is to awaken us to truth. Through this awakening, we discover inner strengths we never knew we had, courage that emerges in our darkest hours, resilience that grows after every setback, and compassion that blossoms from our own healing. This compassion extends beyond ourselves, allowing us to connect deeply with others, recognizing that their pain is no different from ours. The Buddha reminded us that when we understand our own suffering, we develop the ability to hold space for others with kindness, patience, and non-judgment. This shared humanity creates a bridge of empathy, reminding us that we are all part of a greater whole. In this expanded awareness, wisdom takes root. It guides us to act with intention rather than impulse, to choose responses that bring peace instead of chaos, and to walk through life with a steady heart, even when the path is uncertain. Accepting suffering also reveals the impermanent nature of all things. Pleasures fade, pains fade, moments rise and fall like waves on the ocean. This realization allows us to detach from extremes and embrace a balanced way of living. We stop chasing fleeting happiness and start cultivating inner peace, a peace that is unaffected by external circumstances. The Buddha's teachings remind us that liberation comes not from avoiding life's hardships, but from understanding them fully. When we no longer fear suffering, we become truly free, free to grow, free to love, free to live with clarity. In this freedom, wisdom flourishes naturally, guiding us toward a life of compassion, mindfulness, and deep inner harmony. As we continue walking this inner path, the acceptance of suffering gradually becomes a powerful form of inner strength, a foundation on which true wisdom steadily rises. The Buddha often emphasized that the mind is like a wild flame, restless, reactive, and easily disturbed, and suffering becomes the fuel that helps us learn how to tame that flame. When we stop resisting our pain, we begin to see the subtle workings of the mind more clearly. How quickly it clings to desires, how fiercely it rejects discomfort, and how automatically it creates fear from uncertainty. By observing these movements with calm attention, we start breaking the old habits that keep us trapped in cycles of frustration and disappointment. This awareness shows us that suffering is not an external force attacking us. It is the echo of our own attachments. The more we cling, the more we hurt. And as we recognize this truth, a gentle shift happens within. We begin releasing old expectations, forgiving past hurts, and letting go of the rigid identities we cling to. Each release makes space for clarity, just as clearing dust from a window allows more light to enter. Slowly, wisdom becomes less an idea and more of a living presence in our daily behavior, shaping how we speak, how we make decisions, and how we relate to others. We notice that our reactions become softer, our thoughts more stable, and our hearts more open. The Buddha taught that a wise person does not deny suffering, but faces it with calm curiosity, knowing it contains the seeds of transformation. With this mindset, even the most painful moments become opportunities to deepen self-understanding. When we encounter loss, we learn the value of presence. When we face failure, we learn humility and perseverance. When we feel lonely, we learn the importance of compassion, both for ourselves and others. Over time, we stop seeing suffering as a punishment and begin seeing it as a natural part of the human experience, one that binds us together. This realization fosters deep compassion, for we understand that every person we meet carries their own struggles, fears, and hidden wounds. The Buddhist path reminds us that suffering is not the end of our journey, but the beginning of a greater awakening. When we understand its purpose, suffering becomes lighter and wisdom becomes brighter. Through acceptance, observation, and compassion, we develop an inner freedom that cannot be broken by circumstances. This freedom is the essence of wisdom, the ability to remain peaceful, clear, and loving in a world that constantly changes.
As this journey continues to unfold, we begin to see that accepting suffering is not merely an inner practice. It becomes a profound shift in how we live, how we move through the world, and how we interpret every experience that touches our lives. The Buddha taught that when we hold suffering with awareness instead of resistance, it begins to dissolve its sharp edges and reveals the wisdom hidden beneath its surface. With time, we realize that every difficulty carries two layers: the outer pain, which is inevitable, and the inner story we create about it, which is optional. As we become more mindful, the unnecessary stories begin to fade, leaving only the raw truth of the moment, which is far easier to face. This understanding gives rise to a deep inner peace, one that doesn't depend on perfect circumstances, but on clear perception. We begin to trust ourselves more, to trust the natural rhythm of life, and to trust that even our darkest experiences have something to teach.
Rupees
This trust is a quiet,
48
steady
received on
confidence that
PhonePe.
keeps us anchored, even when life changes without warning. It teaches us that wisdom is not gained by running toward pleasure or away from pain, but by standing firmly in the middle with a balanced heart. And when our heart becomes balanced, our perspective changes dramatically. We no longer see suffering as something that steals our happiness. Instead, we see it as something that refines our soul, much like fire purifies gold. This shift makes us more resilient,
no longer fragile in the face of adversity, no longer dependent on constant comfort, no longer shaken by life's inevitable ups and downs. We learn to respond rather than react, to breathe rather than panic, to observe rather than judge. This presence transforms not only our inner world, but also our relationships with others. We become more patient with people's imperfections, more understanding of their struggles, and more willing to forgive. Compassion becomes our natural response, not because we force it, but because we now see ourselves in others. We realize that everyone suffers, everyone longs for peace, and everyone is trying their best with the awareness they have. This realization forms the root of true wisdom, the wisdom that sees beyond separation and understands that all beings are intertwined. In this interconnectedness, we find a new purpose, to live not just for ourselves, but for the well-being of others as well. When we help lighten someone else's burden, our own suffering feels lighter too. And as compassion deepens, suffering loses its power to control us. It becomes a teacher that guides rather than an enemy that attacks. The Buddha's message becomes clear. Suffering is not meant to break us, but to break open the walls that keep us from seeing truth. When we accept this, wisdom naturally arises, and our life becomes a journey of clarity, courage, and profound inner freedom. As we continue to deepen our understanding, the acceptance of suffering ultimately becomes a powerful catalyst for awakening, gently reshaping the way we think, feel, and experience our inner world. The Buddha often reminded his disciples that awareness transforms everything it touches, and when we bring awareness to suffering, something remarkable happens. The fear surrounding it begins to dissolve. Instead of shrinking away from discomfort, we begin to meet it with openness, curiosity, and even gratitude, because we know it carries insights that comfort alone could never offer. With this shift, our relationship with life changes completely. We no longer cling desperately to moments of pleasure, nor do we collapse under the weight of difficult times. We begin to understand the impermanent nature of all things, realizing that every moment, joyful or painful, is simply a passing wave in the vast ocean of experience. This understanding creates emotional balance, allowing us to stay centered even when outer circumstances fluctuate. In this balanced state, wisdom flows more naturally. We start recognizing the subtle ways in which our own desires, expectations, and fears create unnecessary suffering. We see how craving for certainty disrupts our peace, how attachment to outcomes creates anxiety, and how resisting change leads to inner turmoil. This clarity empowers us to let go, not out of force, but out of genuine realization. Letting go becomes a gentle act of liberation, releasing the burdens that were never ours to carry. And as we release, we find more room inside ourselves for compassion, kindness, and understanding. Compassion becomes deeper because suffering has softened our hearts. Kindness becomes effortless because we no longer operate from defensiveness. Understanding becomes clearer because we have learned to listen to life rather than fight it. Through this transformation, suffering becomes a teacher that walks beside us rather than an enemy that attacks. We begin to make choices rooted in calmness rather than fear, in awareness rather than impulse. Our words become more thoughtful, our actions more intentional, and our presence more peaceful. Others may notice the change even before we fully do. They may feel more comfortable around us, more understood, more supported. In this way, wisdom doesn't just benefit the individual, it radiates outward and becomes a source of healing for others. This is the true essence of the Buddha's path, personal transformation that inspires collective harmony. And as our wisdom deepens, we start experiencing something profound, inner freedom. This freedom is not the absence of problems, but the absence of bondage. It is the ability to remain steady in chaos, to smile even in uncertainty, to walk with gentleness even through pain. We realize that suffering no longer defines us. Instead, it refines us, shapes us, and strengthens our spirit. This freedom is the quiet, unshakable peace the Buddha spoke of, a peace born from understanding,
acceptance, and the courage to face life exactly as it is.